Hey guys, welcome to Practical Home Projects. So we just wrapped up the installation of our cabinets, and I kind of want to go through to you how we set those up and got them nice and level, and specifically how we got the use of shims to get that where we needed it to be. So kind of the first thing you need to do is find out exactly what height you want your cabinets to be, and then we use a laser level to make sure that all the cabinets were perfectly level all the way around the room. So that's side to side level, and then front to back level. We pretty much make sure that we use a bubble level, and then every time we install a new cabinet we check to make sure the fronts of them are perfectly lined up. So we started at the high point of the room and we kind of worked our way to the low point of the room. Since this is an older house, there was maybe 3/4 of an inch drop from one corner to the opposite corner. So obviously with the first cabinets we didn't need to use so many shims, but then as we went around we used thicker and thicker shims. So these are some basic cedar shims that you can pick up from your local store. So they go from tapered down to 0 all the way up to about 1/4 inch. So we went with these just because they're easy to use, cheap, and relatively easy to kind of break off. So cedar is a wood of choice. It's relatively hard and also has good friction, so they don't usually wiggle too much once they're in place. Plastic shims are also pretty common because plastic doesn't compress as much. I think those are a little bit more difficult to break off, so that's kind of why we went with these. So the first thing you're going to start off leveling is the bottom of your cabinet. So let's go ahead and look at that real quick. So this gap under the cabinet is maybe 1/3 of the way down our run. So I've already got this right side stabilized, so this isn't going to go anywhere. What you'll see is a full shim is not thick enough to go under there, so we need to use 2 shims. So rather than use 2 shims kind of oriented the same way where you have a really steep slope, I actually like to do it the opposite way so that the 2 shims are making a parallel plane to each other, and then you can just run them this way to make that plane get thicker or shorter. So that's what we're going to do right here when we install this one. So I've already got 2 shims where I kind of broke off the narrow ends because I know about how long it is. So what I like to do is I like to put the bottom shim pretty much lined up with the front of the cabinet, and then the top shim I will tuck in on top of it and then pull it towards me until it's snug. So we have the luxury right now of the fact that it's already set to the right height. So when we first installed this, I actually did use 2 shims kind of this way to tap it into place, and then once I got the height, I set the height with another piece of wood, and then now we've pulled it out and we're resetting it. So now that I've got that height, I'm just going to pull it as snug as I can get it, and I see that the bottom one is poking out just a little bit. So I'm just going to get something, I'll use another shim to kind of tap that in just a little bit. So now I got it nice and snug. So now what I need to do is break it as close to flush as I possibly can. So the reason I did it this way is that now there's a little gap underneath it, so that'll give me a little bit more leverage when I'm breaking this. Some people will actually cut these ahead of time and then place them. I like to have them placed so I get it exactly where I want it, and then I'll either score it with a knife, or if it's kind of thick like this is right now, I will score it with a little hand saw and then just snap it right at that point. So this is just a fine-tooth little saw. So what I'm going to do is get this flush and go ahead and start. I'm not trying to saw all the way through it right now. I'm just trying to score that spot. Where we want it, and then it'll break off right at that point. And then if I have a few little pieces of wood chips sticking out there, I can cut them off. And you'll see it's pretty snug and tight in there, but it is wiggling a little bit. So what I'm going to do before I wrap up is just put a dab of wood glue across it, and then hopefully over time as it settles, or if there's any movement later on, it won't work its way back out. But that's pretty much how you get your shims in place and smoothed off, and then of course we'll put the toe kick in front of this so you won't be able to see any of this in the finished product. So we also put shims on the backs of our cabinets because the wall was angled away just a little bit. So what this does is it holds them perfectly level while we put the screws in, and then the screws sort of bind them into place. So the same thing as with over there, we're going to kind of score them and then just snap them off, and then the countertops are going to go right over the top of this. You'll never see them. So with this one, it's relatively thin right there. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and just mark it with a utility knife to make sure that it cuts right where we want it. So these are not load bearing. It's pretty much just there to make sure that the screw doesn't move around in the future. And then snap it off. Make sure that we don't wiggle it out of place too much. That's wiggling a little bit. There was one place in our upper cabinets where, as we went further and further along, the gap behind the cabinets got wider and wider, and we actually had to use several shims. So, like I said a minute ago, instead of just stacking all of your shims this way, I like to alternate the orientation of the shims so that you end up with sort of two parallel planes. But then it gets a little bit more tricky trying to pull them apart. So you end up sort of pulling the narrow sides out, and you end up with it sort of like that, and then just keep pulling until you get the thickness that you need. And then you end up having two shims to break off at the top and getting it perfectly flush. But I like using it this way because now you have those two parallel planes, and then if you drive your screw either straight through it or right next to it, you know that you'll get lots of good surface contact rather than just kind of one sharp point if you have all your wedges facing the same direction. So right here we're kind of near the end of the run, and like I said, there's almost 3/4 of an inch difference between one end of the room and the other end of the room. So rather than just stack up a bunch of shims, we actually put a piece of wood, screwed it to the floor right there at that edge, and then we just had to use one little shim to raise up our cabinet. I like this style a little bit better because it feels a lot more secure than using a bunch of shims. So the width of the shim is actually designed to be slightly less than double the width of a cabinet. So obviously if you only have one width of the cabinet like we do right here on the side of our refrigerator panel, then you have to cut the shim in half, which is what we did right here, and that way it fits neatly in between the edges of that. So we're going to put our LVP flooring around this and then our shoe molding up above it to kind of cover that up. But you have to be very careful at keeping it nice and straight right here. And then of course we still got the same possibility of this wiggling, so I'm just going to put a dab of glue on it in the future as well. So that's kind of what we learned about using shims in this project. So if any of you guys have any other suggestions or comments, please leave those down below. And if you liked what you saw today, please like and subscribe. Thanks and have a good one.